Hey, welcome back to the channel. We've just come back from a really fun landscape photography adventure here in Switzerland, where we practiced focus stacking and exposure bracketing to create an optimal landscape shot with insanely deep depth of field, giving us perfect sharpness from the near foreground all the way out to the distant background. Stick around because we're about to walk you through the whole thing.
Okay, so let me first talk about a little issue that I've heard about from some members of the group and which gave me the idea to do this video in the first place. It has to do with aperture settings. And for most of us who have done landscape photography, we're quite used to photographing with f/16, f/22 even, to really maximize our depth of field. And if you've ever looked at a hyperfocal table to calculate sort of the optimal focus distance for your lens when you're doing landscape shots with a small aperture, you're familiar with this process. So the idea is that you pick a certain distance based on lens information that allows you to really extract maximum sharpness out of the scene when you're closed down to a small aperture. And it does work pretty well, but there are some lenses that, for whatever reason, just don't give you enough sharpness right underneath the lens in the foreground. And because we've got such a great foreground here, I don't want to stuff that up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a series of shots with the lens focused on my immediate foreground. Then I'm going to focus a little bit deeper into the scene on my middle ground area. I'm going to take a second shot there. And then I'm going to focus all the way back on the mountain in the background and take a third shot. And we're going to blend these pictures together in Photoshop and really just make use of the sharpest regions of each of the three shots. In the end, we should have a photo that has even deeper depth of sharpness than something that we photographed with f/16 or f/22. And so now you might be asking, well, which aperture are you going to use for these three individual shots? What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose an aperture that I know is one of the best performing apertures in this lens. So for every lens, there tends to be kind of a sweet spot in terms of the aperture setting. And what I mean is, usually if you swing your aperture toward the middle, something like f8 or f9, and it's a little bit different on every lens, but usually it's in the middle there, these apertures tend to provide just the best overall clarity and contrast and sharpness across the whole scene. Now, they may not be the apertures that provide the maximum amount of depth of field, but in terms of overall image quality, they tend to perform a little bit better. So I'm going to set my aperture right to f8, and I'm going to use that as my aperture for all three of these photos because I know I'm going to get the maximum performance out of the lens if I do so. Now, obviously, what I have to do here is use a tripod. This would not work if I did it by hand because we really need those frames to match up perfectly with each other. Otherwise, there's no blending these shots together in Photoshop. Okay, so you might think that we're really splitting hairs here, and you're asking yourself, why would I even bother doing all this if I'm getting reasonably sharp pictures at f/16? I would say go ahead and carry on photographing with f/16. If you're not having any problems, there's nothing to worry about. But for a lot of us, we're hoping to nail, a great landscape picture that we could print at a very large size, do something like a gallery size print to hang on the wall at home. And for those kinds of prints, of course, any extra sharpness and image quality that we can get is an advantage. We may be splitting hairs here, but we're also probably going to see the effects if we do enlarge these photos to a reasonable size.
Well, top of the morning to you. It is sunrise. We are out here at the same spot and we are just blessed with some amazing weather. And we're back here doing the same thing that we were doing yesterday. Glad that we practiced it because we have not had any coffee and I'm actually having a hard time forming my own sentences right now. So anyway, we'll keep it short and sweet. I'm just repeating the same steps that I did yesterday, focusing about a meter away from the lens, doing a shot and doing another out here in this clump of trees in the middle ground, focused about 6 meters away, and then doing a shot focused on the distant background. The only difference with today's shot as opposed to yesterday's is that I'm using a polarizing filter in front of the lens just to cut back a little bit on the glare in the foreground. It seemed like that was kind of dominating the picture a little bit, so I twisted the polarizer until that was subdued. I also have done 3 different exposures at each of the 3 focus positions. So I'm doing that because we've got some very bright distant part of the shot here. The scene in the background is very bright compared to the foreground. and I'm anticipating the need to blend some exposures together in order to get kind of the maximum contrast and definition out of the foreground. All right, so that's the strategy. Time to catch a couple hours of sleep and head back to the studio where we can get these pictures in the computer and start playing around. So I've got my pictures imported into Lightroom, and I've done a little bit of pre-organizing to get myself ready for the post-processing. What I've done is I've just started by going through the shoot and finding my different exposure bracketing series, and I've been marking those with some different color labels just so I can kind of identify which groupings belong together. So as you'll remember from being out in the field with me, the approach was to bracket our exposures 3 shots at a time and doing 3 different sets of those bracketed exposures, one for the foreground, one for the middle ground, and one for the background. So the first step here is going to be to isolate those individual bracketed groups and blend those exposures together for one foreground HDR image, one middle ground HDR image, and one background HDR image. And then we'll be ready to go into Photoshop to take a look at blending these different focus distances together. So let's just bounce back to our first series. I'm going to highlight all 3 of these shots, do a control click right in the middle of one of the pictures, and go to HDR. Okay, and now Lightroom's auto-aligning these pictures, and it's going to take the best parts of each shot and blend them together for this high dynamic range image. And look at that, there it is, all set. We don't have a need for deghosting in this case. I don't have anybody like passing through the frame. And I noticed sometimes when I have deghosting turned on, like set to high, for example, and I've got a scene where there's clouds moving through, that sometimes it can do some pretty funny things to those clouds that doesn't really look natural. So I'm going to turn the deghosting to none, and I'm going to go ahead and tick this box here for create a stack. And now, as Lightroom merges these photos together, it's going to group everything and keep it organized kind of underneath that HDR shot. Okay, and then we're just going to move on, and we're going to grab the next series for the middle ground and do the same thing. Okay, great. We've got our 3 different bracketed series blended together. We've got HDR images for all 3, and let's just take a quick look here. So they all look very similar, which is a good sign. Here's our foreground blend, nice and sharp. Here's our middle ground blend, less sharp in the foreground, but definitely nice and sharp in the middle ground as we had hoped. And here is our background shot, which looks real sharp out there in the distance, but not so sharp here in the foreground. So as expected, just the way we want it. So we're gonna select all 3 of these now, and I'm gonna do a right click and go to Edit In, and we are going to open these as layers in Photoshop. And if you don't have Photoshop open already, it'll take a minute to just boot that open and convert these into Photoshop documents. So here we are. Okay, here comes layer number 1. Here's layer number 2. And wait for it. Here's layer number 3. Okay, so with the layers in that arrangement, background at the top, middle ground in the middle, foreground right down at the bottom of my layer list, you've got to imagine that these images are layered on top of each other. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mask away the unsharp parts of each of these photos. Okay, so to start out, I'm just going to click on the background layer, and I'm going to go down here and create a layer mask. So with my layer mask selected, I'm going to grab a brush, and I'm going to make sure that I have black. I'm painting with black. So in the color selector here, you can go ahead and type in 000000 to make sure that you're painting with that you're actually erasing, so to speak. So with that selected, I'll close the layers and watch this. I'm going down here to the foreground, and I'm going to zoom in here so that this is a little easier to see. And hopefully you can see the image, getting sharper as I brush out this part of the shot. So I'm just using a really big brush, and holy moly, it's instantaneous. The foreground has just become razor sharp. So I'm gonna back up here just to make this a little bit more of an efficient experience. Don't worry about that white gap at the bottom. If you end up with the same thing in your shot, that can really easily just be removed with applying a very slight crop to the picture afterwards. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go through and erase the foreground out of this background picture. So I'm just going right around the shot and brushing everything out. And I'm gonna go right up to kind of the edge of the water, okay? So foreground and middle ground has been removed. We'll go down to the middle ground, create a layer mask, and this time all we've got to do is remove really like the lower third of our photo, basically, and that's looking a lot better. The white balance is not changing. We should see things getting quite a bit sharper there as we go in. And when you're doing this, it helps to get real up close and personal with the file. So I'm zooming in to 100% and moving in through the foreground here to just take a look and see if there's anything else that I need to brush away. And that's about it. The more precise you can be with this masking technique, the better your results are going to be. And we've got a lot more waiting for you where that came from. So head on over to viewfindermastery.com, where we've got full-length tutorials, thoughtful feedback, and a really fun community of photographers that are waiting for you to join in. And while you're there, go ahead and download our free Top 10 Purchases Guide if you'd like some advice on must-have gear items that won't break the bank.